Thank you so much. Yeah, hi everyone. This workshop will be quite interactive. We have two breakout rooms, and there will be a number of times where I will ask questions into the room. And when that happens, I'm going to invite you to answer the question in the chat. So even if you're not super comfortable being on video, you can just answer the question in the chat, and that won't be visible on the recording. And there will also be a couple of times where I will invite people to just unmute themselves and speak. So you can either do that or just answer the question in the chat. Either way is fine. Okay, before we start, I would quite like to share a quote, which I always share when I do these kind of workshops. Can we have the next slide, please? So the quote goes, "Thanks to our evolutionary history, we're programmed to deal with the lion coming from the woods, not to strategize how to save our civilization over the next 100 years." So climate change is often called a wicked issue because it's really difficult for our brains to process it and therefore take action. And we will come back to this evolutionary principle throughout this workshop and how we can overcome it to make it easier for people to engage with climate change. Next slide, please. So as Matt said, I'm a climate psychologist. I research effective climate communication, in particular, how we can get people concerned about climate change, but avoid falling into despair and instead inspiring hope and action on a community level. I'm originally from Poland and I lived in Aberystwyth until last year. And now I'm traveling around Europe documenting sustainability projects. So I've kind of stepped back a little bit from research, now focusing more on my communication work. And one thing I always focus on is breaking the echo chamber of climate change. It can often be very abstract, very academic. So a lot of my time is spent teaching activists and communicators how to communicate more effectively and in a way that resonates with people and their everyday lives and concerns. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, can we skip this one? This is just the topics for today. Okay, let's do a little icebreaker. I would like you to share in the chat what got you engaged in climate and sustainability. That can be one word, a few words. You don't have to write a lot. Just the first thing that comes to your mind. What got you engaged with us in the first place? Was it a news story? Was it an emotion you felt? Maybe fear? Oh, amazing. So many answers. I'm going to read a few out. Love. I love that. That's such a great answer. Doing a cat course. Very good. A friend seeing the nature I love start to disappear. That was actually one of the reasons I got involved in the first place. So that resonates with me a lot. IPCC report 2019. That got a lot of people involved. Threats to nature, planning for the future, my husband, a career change, red list, XR talk, carbon sequestration. Some really, really good responses here. Thank you so much, everyone. So yeah, a lot of similar ones as well. So a lot of us first got engaged through a news story or coverage of a scientific report or people in our lives and our work. So we'll see throughout this workshop that the people around us and our communities and social influence play a huge role in engaging people in climate issues. So thank you so much for sharing. Next slide, please. Just a few notes before we go more into the facts. So behavior change is a really important component of social change, but we can't separate behavior change from cultural and systemic factors. So what I don't want you to take away from this workshop is that it's all about individual behavior change, because most CO2 emissions and environmental degradations are caused by the systems we all have to navigate, our economic system, our political system, and also the richest 10% of society use the bulk of the resource we have. So most of the people we deal with in our communities are not to blame for the climate crisis because we all have to navigate these systems. But we have a lot of power as individuals if we act collectively, so through our communities. But to inspire wide-scale action, we have to look at how does the human brain work? How can we communicate more effectively to mobilize as many people as possible in a way that works for people? Quick question, and you can just say yes or no in the chat. Have you heard about the value action gap before? And it's also sometimes called the awareness action gap. Yes, yes, no, no. Okay, very mixed. Okay, the majority of people are saying no. Okay, so the awareness action gap basically means that most people do care about climate and sustainability. When you look at opinion polls, most of the time the climate and the environment are pretty high up when it comes to people's biggest concerns. But as we also know, most people don't live these concerns and these values in everyday life. And many people still don't really think about climate change and how it affects their everyday lives. And there's two reasons for this. The first one is a little bit abstract, and it sounds a bit silly, but carbon dioxide is invisible. And climate change hasn't been an issue in humans' evolutionary history. So we never developed the ability to sense it and perceive it as a threat. So we're not programmed to see excess emissions as a threat. The more day-to-day reason, the more everyday reason, is something we call psychological distance, or the feeling that climate change is something that either won't affect us, or it won't affect us or our communities very severely. Obviously, nowadays, people are recognizing more and more that that's not necessarily true. We're seeing entire communities being threatened by sea level rise in Wales, and around the UK, around Europe and the world. But especially in wealthier countries, a lot of people still don't take action on the climate crisis for that very reason, because it's not an immediate threat. And many of us are just busy surviving in day-to-day life. So we can't prioritize climate action for that very reason. We're not going to go into the cost of living crisis in detail, but it's something I've been covering in my peer mentoring work. And if you work with low-income communities, framing the climate crisis in the cost of living crisis is something that's really important. And maybe we can share some resources after this workshop as well, because there's lots of really good resources out there. And last note before we start is that behavior change is tied to inequality and privilege. A lot of people want to live more sustainably, but many of us don't have the time or the resources to do that necessarily. There are lots of ways to live cheaply and sustainably, but also it's impossible to not buy plastic when you go to the supermarket. It's very difficult to live without a car in the countryside with the infrastructure we have. So living more sustainably can be more expensive in some cases or more time consuming. So that's something to be aware of when we try and inspire more sustainable behaviors in our communities. So we will be talking about behavior change today, but I also want to stress that the best thing we can do is to motivate our communities to achieve more wide-scale systemic change, because the systems we navigate do keep us trapped in unsustainable lifestyles. So that's always something that should be on our radar. Next slide, please. So first, I'm just going to give a quick overview of climate psychology and some of the reasons we find it difficult to engage with climate change. Next slide, please. So our brains, the human brain, has evolved to react to existential threats like the climate crisis in 3 different ways. And that's the fight response, the flight response, or the freeze response. I'm assuming that many of you are in the fight response. It's why you're joining this webinar. It's why you want to do something about this issue. The fight response is very active. It can look like climate advocacy, taking action in our communities, or in our own lives. The flight response can look like avoiding the topic altogether or pretending that it's not happening. This is a really interesting one because many of us are very quick to judge or even demonize climate deniers. But in my work, I found that many people who deny that climate change is happening or don't think about it or try not to think about it, it actually comes from a place of fear and even climate anxiety. I've spoken to a lot of people who came across to me as climate deniers, and then through conversation I realized that really they were just extremely scared of climate change and how it will affect their communities, their children, etc. So it can be really helpful to just create a safe space for people to share their emotions and feelings and really pinpoint where that resistance come from, because people can really change their attitudes just by having that place to share how they feel. And the freeze response can look like climate anxiety, being unable to act, a shock response, or fear. So climate anxiety is really the buzzword we talk about when we talk about the freeze response. It's also important to know that we can fluctuate between these three responses. So I deal with climate anxiety sometimes because I do a lot of climate work. It can become really overwhelming. And sometimes, because I deal with climate every day, I just want to get away with it. I don't want to look at the news. And I take a couple of days off where I don't look at the news. I don't do any climate stuff. I just get away from it. And that's a flight response, but that can be a normal and very healthy response if you're dealing with this stuff often. So none of these responses are necessarily right or wrong. But if we get stuck in one of these responses, it can affect our mental health. You can do activism to the point of burnout. Climate denial is often not very healthy, especially when the climate crisis is on your doorstep. And the freeze response, for obvious reasons, can also be bad for our mental health if we're in a constant state of fear or anxiety. And a lot of these reactions are also influenced by the way we communicate about climate change. Some of you will remember the Australia bushfires in 2019, or 2020, which were very, very big in the news. And a lot of people reacted with fear and shock when they saw those news. So the way messages are framed can have a really big impact on how people react. Next slide, please. So this is some really interesting data that's just good to be aware of. This is UK-wide data. I'm not sure there's data for Wales. There might be, but this data is UK-wide. But yeah, it's just data that's good to know about because it shows us the scale of the challenge we're facing when it comes to climate communication. So 42% of people in the UK feel that they're being lectured about climate change. 56% cannot confidently explain what net zero means. So net zero is a law, a UK law that we must get to net zero emissions by 2050. And 52% of people feel powerless in the fight against climate change, which is really the most worrying statistic for me, because if we have a population, if half the population feels powerless, they're not going to do anything about it because they feel like there's nothing they can do as one person. And we also often see that young people in particular, when young people feel powerless, they don't go and vote, they don't engage with their communities. And that's a huge issue for obvious reasons when we have a whole generation that's politically alienated and feeling disempowered. Next slide. Another question for the chat. How do these headlines make you feel? And I would like for you to share one word, one emotion. How do these headlines make you feel? I'm just going to read them out in case someone can't see them very well. Soon the world will be unrecognizable. Is it still possible to prevent total climate meltdown? UN finds no credible pathway to 1.5 in place. Major climate changes inevitable and irreversible. What comes after the coming climate anarchy? Sorry, this one always makes me laugh a little bit because it's very dramatic. Okay, so some of the chat responses. Desperately sad, distraught, scared, apocalyptic, scared, despair, depressed, despair, scared, frustrated, depressing, scared, desperate, motivated to act, angry, helpless, despair, scary, helpless. Okay, so this is a really, really good example for a phenomenon called climate doomism. And climate doomism is the belief that it's already too late to do something about the climate crisis. So our brains have evolved to pay more attention to negative information as a survival mechanism. If you think back to the lion, if we're faced with the lion who's trying to eat us, our brain needs to be very, very, very quick to react. And the media knows this, and they relentlessly exploit this fact for clicks. Obviously, we are going to click on this headline because we perceive it as a threat. But if we see too many of these headlines, we become desensitized and we stop engaging with an issue. And as we saw in the chat, the vast majority of people react to these sort of headlines with negative emotions. And there's a tiny minority who will feel motivated to act, but this messaging doesn't have that effect on the majority of the population. So this chat is actually a really good example of how this messaging affects people on a bigger scale as well. So thank you so much for sharing. So yeah, people feel powerless and hopeless when they see this kind of messaging and ultimately don't take action on climate. So when we talk about climate change, we need to make sure that we convey the urgency of the situation, but also help people understand that all of the solutions we could possibly need are already out there. And we know about the solutions, but we need to demand those solutions. We need to work on those solutions in our communities, and we also need to demand those solutions from our political leaders. Next slide, please. Just a quick note on climate anxiety, because some of you might be working with young people, and climate anxiety is a big thing in for both millennials and Gen Z in particular. So this was a study by the University of Bath in 2021, which surveyed 10,000 young people from around the world, including the UK. And the results were that 75% of young people think that the future is frightening. 58% feel betrayed by their governments. So again, we see this political disempowerment and alienation here. And most worryingly, for me at least, is that 45% of young people say that climate change is affecting their daily lives and functioning. And in psychology, when an issue is starting to affect someone's everyday life and functioning, that's when it starts becoming a mental illness. So this is something we need to take very seriously. Almost half of young people around the world feel like this. And I believe the UK data was quite similar to this average. So just something to be aware of when you work with young people. Young people need a lot of empowerment. Young people need to, when they're engaged in an initiative, young people need to feel ownership of the projects they're part of, because that will build a sense of, next slide, please. Drum roll. Oh no, next slide, sorry. Agency. And I would love for someone to raise their hand, or a couple of people, and explain what agency means to you. There's no right or wrong. I would just love to hear someone's definition of agency. Would someone like to come in and speak? Or answer in the chat if you're more comfortable with that. Someone says empowerment in the chat. Yeah, go ahead.
There's something here. We're running an initiative in KLY, and agency gives a sense of power to the people in our community who are now going to organize themselves to become self-sufficient in renewably grown food. So going to tackle owning their own energy supply, and they're going to be looking at preventative methods for mental well-being in the community. There are lots of people out there who want to do something, and what we should be doing is probably focusing on those and working with them, giving them agencies. In our case, we're using community assemblies to do that, and it's working.
That's a really beautiful example. Thank you so much for sharing, Mike. And yeah, community assemblies are a really powerful tool. I'm just going to read a few answers from the chat as well. Someone said choice, motivation, feeling that you can act, control over your life, influential, support and permission to take action. Agency is choosing to act with all the capacity I have, helping people to have agency can be helping them to feel like they can act, that it has an impact and that it's worth the effort. I couldn't have defined it in a better way than all of you just have. That was very beautiful. Thank you. So, yeah, agency is the feeling and knowledge that our actions are effective and making a difference. And when people feel agency, it becomes a self-reinforcing power. Another term that is often used, which is not the same as agency, but it's very related, is self-efficacy. And it basically means the self is effective. So what we do is effective. So what we really want to do is build people's feeling of self-efficacy, which is a contributing factor to agency. So we can kind of remember it as self-efficacy is a feeling, agency is something that we have, it's a driving force within ourselves and our communities. And this is also why it's so important to focus on climate solutions and also community wins. In your initiatives, you really want to, what you want to do is spotlight what people like you and me are doing in everyday life to make the world a better place, because people really need to see what they can do. They don't need to see what politicians are doing, what famous people are doing, what famous activists are doing. We really need to focus on what you can do as a community member, and that really helps people build agency and motivation to act. Okay, one more slide before we go into our first breakout room. Next slide, please. Thank you. Another area of behavior change that's often neglected is nature connection, which is why I want to quickly mention it now. So nature is not just the ecological foundation of all life on Earth. It's also really good for us. It's really good for our physical health, for our mental health. And a few years ago, researchers found that spending 2 hours a week in nature, that doesn't have to be 2 hours in one day, that can literally be 20 or half an hour a day. It reduces feelings of stress, anxiety, depression, and lots of other mental health issues. But the interesting thing about nature connection, spending time in nature, is also that it makes us act more sustainably. I do a lot of research on early childhood climate engagement and climate understanding. And last year, I worked in a piece of research which found that when you expose young people to the natural world, if you spend time in nature as a young person, it will really shape pro-environmental behavior in adulthood. So what we often see is that most children care about nature and animals, but often that care takes a dip in our teenage years because teenagers have a lot of other things to worry about. But whether that care and concern picks up again in the later teenage years and early adulthood is thought to be influenced by how much time you spent in nature as a young person. So if you work with young people, especially in early childhood or middle childhood until age 12, get them out there in nature. It's really good for their mental health, and it will really influence whether they engage with environmental issues throughout life. Okay, we are going to go into our first breakout room. Can we have the next slide, please, so I can explain it very quickly? So we're going to go into groups of 3 or 4 people for 10 to 15 minutes. And I would like you to share what are your community's barriers to climate action or engagement. And that can be mental barriers, barriers to engagement, like the psychological ones we just spoke about. They can be physical ones, like accessibility. They can be social. Sometimes we don't act on climate change because none of our friends do, and it's a little bit awkward. Or it can be communication. Is your communication maybe not as effective as it could be? Do people know about your initiative? So it could be either one of those categories of factors or several factors at the same time. So I would just like you to share what sort of factors pose barriers to people's engagement, and you will potentially find that you're facing very similar barriers in engaging people or retaining engagement over time. So it's just an informal sharing round. Each of you can speak for a minute or two, and then you can maybe find where there's similarities or differences, and then we'll all come back here and maybe some of us can share what we learned from each other. Is everything clear? Any questions before we go into breakout rooms? Very well. Matt, can you work your magic, please? Is this everyone, Matt?
Sorry, yes, everyone should be back now.
Amazing, thank you so much. Welcome back, everyone. I'm just going to open the space for 5 minutes for people to share anything that you learned from each other, any similarities and the challenges you're facing. Don't have to go into a lot of detail if you're not comfortable. But yeah, just anything you realized that you found surprising, that you found reassuring, maybe. Just want to open the space for folks to share. And just want to invite you to raise your hand and speak. And if you're not comfortable speaking, you can also share in the chat. Liz.
Firstly, it was a really great opportunity for networking. That was lovely to meet some other people with the same challenges. I think the one that we all struck a chord on was the feeling that all our audiences are overwhelmed by constant bombardment, and so the cut through is an issue. So overwhelm of messages, social media overload, that kind of stuff. So yeah, that was one we all shared.
Yeah, absolutely. I see that happening a lot, that information overwhelm. Our brains haven't evolved to process the information we process today. I read a statistic somewhere that there's more information in a newspaper today or an online news website than people like processing their entire lifetime 200 years ago, something like that. But the amount of information we have online is quite extreme. I'm just going to read a few things from the chat. Mentor, too busy. Mainstream media has made activists scary to the public. Yes, that's so true. Communication, how to reach those who are not yet engaged. Yeah, that's a big challenge. Someone's saying engaging younger generations and communications. I'm going to get to that in a bit in the presentation. Other priorities that are more immediate. That's very true, especially in the cost of living crisis. People still don't feel it in their hearts, a mental engagement issue. Yeah, that's psychological distance, as I mentioned earlier. How not to judge people. That's a practice. It's really difficult when even your friends don't get it. People are so distracted. People are too comfortable, don't want to sacrifice their material world. Also very true. Fear stops us from the sacrifice we need to make. That's also very interesting because we often think about sacrifice when we think about climate action, but I also want to invite you all to think about how can we frame climate action in terms of abundance? Because really, sacrifice is what we're going to face if we don't take climate action. We're going to lose so many of the things we love, but if we do take climate action, we can gain so much. We can build a beautiful, better, more just world. So framing climate action in terms of abundance has been shown to often be a lot more effective, even if a little bit of sacrifice is involved, but you don't necessarily want to frame your messages that way. Yes, is it Mega? How do you pronounce it correctly?
Michael.
Oh, Michael.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Michael. Sorry. Yeah. Thanks for this engaging talk today. It's really interesting. In our group, what we talked about the importance of not alienating people, not to lecture people. And that leads on also when we talk about people, we have to also recognize there's a diverse class, ethnic groups in Britain. And sometimes the message of the climate movement, well, to be clear about it, it can be very middle class. So speaking in its own echo chamber. So that's one avenue. But for me personally, and a couple other people in our group, it's the abject lack of that ethical responsibility, moral responsibility from government leadership. There is no clear education about the climate crisis, to the general public. To the government, it doesn't exist. It's for many people, the crisis is heard of, but never really experienced. So that's also a hindrance. But undoubtedly, we have challenges. But coming to events like that gives me reassurance that we can really, find a way forward.
Thank you for sharing. I'm really happy that you find it reassuring. And yeah, your points are really valid. Just responding to your first point, working class people and people on a low income will be disproportionately affected by the climate crisis. So it's so crucial that we include working class people and folks on a lower income in our communication. Because those members of society are often the ones who can't afford to focus on sustainability and climate action because there's so many other things that they have to worry about. And that resonates with me a lot as a working class person. When I was at university, I didn't have time to worry about climate change until I was in a position where I was a bit more financially stable. And that's the case for many people. And yes, meeting people where they're at is so important. And again, I'm going to find some resources to send round on framing climate change in the cost of living crisis, because it's a really crucial point to consider in this current societal and political climate. I'm just going to read a couple more responses in the chat. Time, cost, not knowing where to start, policy slowdown, not being able to see the impact, someone to lead on climate action in the community who has the time to commit to it. And this comes back to the educational aspect of it, because we don't really get the education in our educational system or top down, really. That education needs to come from our communities and our social circles. And educating our community members is also so much more effective. And we're going to talk about social influence in a bit, but education through community is almost more powerful than it could be if it came from the top down. So that's a really good point as well. Behavior of activists is alienating. That's definitely an issue sometimes. People not acting as community, lack of government policy, peer pressure with young people and consumerism, the scales beyond most people's scope, being too comfortable, the weakness or absence of community. A lot of younger generations are expectant. So many people respond with recycling. There are no social consequences for being a polluter. It's a depressing prospect for young people. Little government regulation. Wow, there's so many great responses in the chat. Thank you so much, everyone. This is really great. Okay.
Oh, sorry.
No, go on.
I was just thinking how you were talking about education, and activism isn't something that is encouraged or I'm probably actively discouraged in school. But if as part of something like, I don't know what subject it would be, that young people were encouraged to think of themselves as potential activists, that would just be so great, because in a democracy, why not?
Yeah, absolutely. A few people said in the chat that activists, get a bad rep, both because of the behavior of some, but also dominant media narratives. So one thing we can do is play with the word a bit and maybe say advocate instead of activist, and just use a different word to make it more palatable for parents, for example. But one thing I also mentioned in a peer mentoring session I did a couple of weeks ago. So when I did research on early childhood climate engagement, I came across this really wonderful case study where I believe it was in a community group. Children had almost a workshop on how to send a letter to their local representative, so the local councillor, for example, and it was about protecting some trees in a local park. And the children send those letters to the representative, and the representative didn't respond. And then the kids, who are like 8 years old, they self-organized and staged a protest outside the councillor's office, and that then made the councillor respond to the letters. But it was really amazing, because when the kids, when they were provided with the safe space where they could learn how to engage with those in power, and they got the support they needed and the encouragement they needed, they actually self-organized to put pressure on the local representatives, which is just such a beautiful example. Because often we think that, young people will save the world, but actually that puts a lot of pressure on young people. Young people don't know how to save the world. Young people deeply, deeply care, but they also need adult guidance. So creating these safe spaces that encourage activism in an accessible way that is relevant to children's everyday life, for example, protecting some local trees, that can be very, very powerful. So also want to encourage you to think about what that could look like in your communities. All right, shall we move on? So now we're going to talk about something that's called behavioral neuroscience, which is basically how our brains work and how behavior is shaped in our brains. I promise it's going to be a lot less complex than it sounds, but it's a very fascinating topic. Next slide, please. So our brains have this incredible feature called plasticity. And just like with plastics, it means that they're flexible and they can bend a little bit. So many people believe that we're hardwired in our behavior through our genes, but in reality, our environment and habits really shape the way that we think and we act. So a few examples of plasticity. When someone goes blind, when someone is not blind from birth, but experiences blindness at some point in their lives, what we see happen is that people develop a really good sense of hearing. So what happens is that the brain area that's responsible for seeing dedicates less space to seeing and more space to hearing. So one area in the brain will shrink and the other one will grow, which is really fascinating. To compensate for the lack of sight, basically, the brain literally changes its composition. And similarly, when you practice a skill, for example, learning a language or learning an instrument, that area in your brain will start growing. And this is something that happens throughout life if you really put your mind to it. There's a misconception that we're less able to do that, to change habits or learn new skills later in life. But really the only thing that changes is that we become more entrenched in our habits. So this idea that we're less able to do that later in life, it's nothing to do with our plasticity in our brains. It's only to do with the fact that we've had more time to develop certain habits, but we can still break those habits and create new ones and change how our brain operates. So the brain is just so powerful, and it's really interesting to think about it this way, that you can always change people's attitudes and behaviors if you know how. Next slide, please. So how are behaviors formed? Behaviors are formed through the interaction of different factors. And four of these factors, the main four factors are listed here. They're genes, habits, rewards, and our environments. So genes do play a role in how we behave, but you can think of them more as a predisposition. So if you have a certain set of genes, it means that you're more likely to act in a certain way. For example, I don't know, you're a little bit more impulsive, so you tend to impulse buy stuff, but it doesn't mean that you're hardwired to do so. If you're an impulse buyer, you can train yourself to not do that. So I used to be an impulse buyer. I used to be a bit of a consumerist when I was in my teenage years. And then I imposed the rule that if I want to buy something, I give myself at least 24 hours to sleep on it and think about, do I actually need this thing? And I trained myself to not be an impulse buyer anymore. So despite my genes or my family history meaning that I'm a little bit impulsive, I trained myself to not live out this predisposition in my behavior. So, Kathy, would you mind muting yourself? Sorry, there's just a little bit of background noise.
Sorry.
That's okay. Thank you. So our habits control what we do in everyday life. A lot of what we do is on autopilot. When you get up in the morning, you go to the bathroom, you brush your teeth, you often don't really very consciously think about it. You do those things on autopilot. When you brush your teeth, you don't necessarily think about how you brush your teeth. You've brushed your teeth in a certain way for most of your life, so you just do that without thinking about it super consciously. So those are habits. But the good news is that habits can be changed, although admittedly that can be a little bit challenging. Now, rewards play a huge role in how habits are formed, and they're very closely connected to habits. So social media is a really good example of how habits are formed through rewards. So if you post a photo on social media, whenever you get a little like or a comment, or even when you go on your feed and you scroll and you see new content, your brain's reward system is activated. If you get a like, that's a form of social feedback. Someone likes your photo, and your brain interprets that as that person has given me positive feedback. And your brain will release some happy chemicals, and that's a reward reaction. And that will keep you engaged with that action of using social media. Social media companies know that, and they've designed their apps in a way that gets you hooked on them. And they use rewards and our brain's reward center a lot in doing that. So yeah, when your brain's reward center is activated often enough, a habit is formed, and you can apply that to lots of different areas. But the factor that really encompasses all of these factors is our environments and the people around us. So our environments can influence how our genes are expressed, and this happens in the womb, and it happens throughout life. Our environments are a huge factor in how our genes are expressed, and our environments shape our habits, of course, and our environments also determine what kind of rewards are available. So how our habits are formed. Next slide, please. So one reward that's super, super powerful is social influence and social rewards. So whenever I speak to groups who have behavior change as one of their goals, the number one thing you want to focus on is social influence. Because what people around us do and how we compare ourselves to the people around us is the key thing that motivates us. So what you want to do is make sustainability look desirable. You want to make it look fun, and you want to frame sustainability as something that people can passionate about. And you want to frame sustainable lifestyles as something people can thrive in. So it kind of goes back to what I said earlier about sacrifice. So the thing with sacrifice, the principle is similar to negative news headlines. It will work with some people. Usually people are already somewhat engaged. It won't work so well with mainstream audiences. So if you want to reach community members who are not necessarily engaged with climate yet, you don't want to frame it in terms of sacrifice. Sacrifice framings can really resonate with people who are already engaged with climate. Sometimes it will resonate with people who are not engaged yet. Sometimes people will resonate with that, but not most people. So that's just something to be aware of. And again, you know your communities best. So you will know when to use those framings and when not to use those framings. But what research tells us is that positive usually works better than negative when you first engage people. Okay, that's it on social influence. Can we have the next slide, please? So when I talk about social influence, I really like this model, this model of space of influence to really show people the many different ways in which social influence operates. So what I like to say is that everyone is an influencer. And I don't mean social media influencers or celebrities or anything like that. What I mean is that everyone is an influencer in their own little bubble of influence. And you can see these little bubbles here. So some of those levels or spheres of influence we have is, for example, doing something on an individual level, changing our own behavior, leading by example, and potentially inspiring others to do the same. So that's the little white bubble here. That's our own little sphere of influence as an individual. We can influence those around us. That's the purple bubble or the purple sphere, through conversations, encouragement, even debates. We can influence our wider community. That's the dark green circle, through outreach, networking, community initiatives. We can use tools like social media or community organizing. That's the light green circle, to reach the wider public. So go beyond our community and reach people at a bit of a wider scale. And then we can use tactics like political lobbying or campaigning or protest to make a difference on a government level. That's the light blue circle. And what I find really empowering is that all of these start with a single individual making a decision to do something about it. And whatever you do, whatever sphere you're aiming at, you always start in the little white bubble here, actions you can take individually. And then as an individual, you can decide to work on in the dark green sphere or in the light blue sphere or anything in between. And depending on which sphere of influence you want to reach, you want to use different communication strategies or organizing strategies. What I find really cool is that nowadays we have the power of being in the digital age, which means we can jump spheres of influence. In the past, when we didn't have the internet or social media, it would take a lot of work to get from the white sphere to the light blue sphere. Those in power were a lot less accessible to us. But now you can literally send a tweet and there's a chance that some MP or journalist will see it. So we can use that to our advantage. Next slide, please. Before we go into the second breakout room, I just want to share some effective communication strategies and tips that we can all use in our community initiatives. Again, I want to stress, you know your communities best. You know which communication strategies will work on who and what the dynamics are of your projects and your communities. But these are strategies that have been proven to work in general. But just take it with a pinch of salt and be aware that every community is different and you will want to use different strategies to a different extent depending on your local context. Next slide, please. So these are my 3 golden rules that I found in my climate communications research for making your communication more effective and inspiring people to become active. The first one is that positive works better than negative. This is very generalized, but basically what it means is that you want to reward people rather than punish them. Again, rewards shape habits, so we want to always work with rewards. So for example, in a community context, that can look like bringing an element of competition into activities. So for example, a litter picking campaign. If you have a litter picking event, you can reward the first person to collect 5 pounds of litter. That's a healthy element of competition, which has been found to be very, very effective. As humans, we love a little bit of competition. And that kind of approach is more effective than, for example, doing a poster campaign shaming people for littering in public places. Shaming can be effective, but healthy competition and social interaction, social reward is a lot more effective, generally. Second golden rule is that you want to work with social rewards and influence. I've said it half a dozen times now, but social influence is really, really, really key. Make your initiatives as interactive and social as possible. Bring people together. Help people bond over sustainability and sustainable behavior change. When people feel like they're doing something as part of a community, they're more likely to keep doing it, because getting people engaged in the first place is a lot easier than keeping them engaged. So we call that retainment, retaining the engagement. That can often be quite tricky. Like I said earlier, a lot of people really care about climate and sustainability, but there's so many other things going on. Many of us struggle to survive month by month. And when we have to prioritize other things in life, sustainability often takes the backseat. But if we do sustainability as part of a community, people are a lot more likely to keep showing up. And here it's also really important who you choose as spokespeople when it comes to social influence, because they have to be relatable to the people you're trying to reach. So, for example, if you want to recruit parents, you want to have a parent as a spokesperson speaking about why this is important to them. There's a group called Parents for Future who does really, really great work on this. They support different environmental climate campaigns and address all of this through the lens of this is why we care about this as parents. Or if you want to reach young people and get young people involved in your initiative, you want to have a young spokesperson because that will be a lot more relatable. And lastly, the third golden rule is that you want to substitute unsustainable behaviors rather than forbidding them. So, for example, if you want people to eat more plant-based foods, you want to teach them how to cook a delicious plant-based meal instead of just saying, you have to eat more plant-based foods, eating meat is bad. Doesn't work very well. And I say that as a vegan person. If you want people to drive less, you want to do something like rewarding people for miles cycle to work. Some employers are starting to set up these schemes where employees get paid, for example, for cycling miles to work. Or you can organize a car sharing network, all of that kind of stuff. The third golden rule is more difficult to implement. It takes quite a bit of creativity and it really depends on the local context, but you just want to think about how can we replace this behavior rather than telling people you can't do this. Again, it's less about sacrifice and more about abundance. Next slide, please. Oh, where's my honeybee slide? Did it get lost somewhere? I did move it around a little bit, but is it further down? There should be a slide which reads the honeybee approach. I was gonna mention that first. Is it the one after this? Yes. Sorry, I just want to mention this first before I go into the examples. So when we implement these 3 golden rules, we often want to use something called the honeybee approach. Basically, what that means is that sometimes we don't want to talk about climate or sustainability directly, especially climate change. Unfortunately, it's such a polarized issue at the moment that quite often we don't want to talk about climate directly, but speak to people's values and other things that they care about. In the cost of living crisis or in low-income communities, we can often frame sustainable behavior change through the lens of saving money. A lot of people are more interested in the health benefits of sustainable behaviors. For example, there was one study a few months ago which showed that half of people in Europe, I think that's all of Europe, including the UK, not just the EU. Half of people in Europe are planning to or trying to eat less meat. And interestingly, the main motivation for this was health benefits rather than environmental benefits. So that's just something to think about. And also we can frame sustainability as something that's trendy, that's desirable. So when you think about these 3 golden rules, think about how can I implement the honeybee approach in this to reach people who are not necessarily engaged with climate yet. Okay. It is 1:15, so I think I'm going to skip over the examples and we'll just send that round so we have enough time for the last breakout room. Is that okay? Can we just skip forward and also skip the bit on social media because we've already spoken about this? Okay, can we skip one more? Perfect. I'm just going to very quickly talk about the previous slide. So some of the ways that you can make climate action more engaging in your community is use events, gamification, competition, influencers in your community, spokespeople, and also giving people as many possibilities as you can to really own the projects they're part of. Anyway, we're going to send around the slides so you can read them in more detail. But now we are going to go into our second breakout room. I believe all of you received a slide with the engagement onion. Does everyone have access to the engagement onion?
Actually, Jessica, I don't think this was sent to the people who recently, who.
Oh, okay. So what we can do before we go into the breakout room, can we get the engagement onion slide and everyone can quickly either do a screenshot of it or take a picture on their phone so they have it visible. No, it's after the breakout room slide. Sorry.
Oh, is that? It's not this one.
No, it says engagement onion, so it's after the breakout room slide. Yeah, there it is. Okay, so in this breakout room, we are going to come up with an engagement plan to involve local community members in your initiative. So think about local community members who are not engaged yet, they don't necessarily care about climate change, and you want to come up with a plan to engage them, taking into account the local context. This is just a space to brainstorm for 10 minutes, to give each other tips, to think about what can we do better, what is already working well, what have we not tried yet. And what you really want to think about is how can we involve the local community and get them to follow and become interested in our initiative, become engaged, and then over time become active members. So really what you want to do is go from the yellow, the outer layer of the onion, to the purple, or at least the light blue layer next to the purple one. So what's your plan of getting people to become aware of your project, interested, engaged, and then active? Because you'll need a slightly different strategy for each of these layers. So just want to invite you to quickly take a picture of the screen so you can look at it while you're in conversation in the breakout rooms, and just have another 10 minutes to share. I think you're going to be in the same breakout groups again, so you'll already be aware of each other's projects and what challenges you're facing. So now we can come together again and brainstorm which of these principles and strategies that we just learned about could we try in our projects to engage more people. Any questions before we go into the breakout room?
No.
Right.
Yeah, most people are in the same groups, but because a few people have dropped out, I've had to shift 2 or 3 people around. That's okay. Just to balance up the numbers. Here we go.
Sorry, ran over a little bit there.
That's all right. Sorry, I didn't send that slide out again.
That's all right. I hopefully most people will have just taken a picture on their phone. But also the basic principle is how can we get people engaged and involved? So it's not, as long as we. Welcome back, everyone. Hello. Are we complete? Are there still people coming in? Okay, in the interest of time, what we're going to do, we're going to invite a couple of people to share their impressions from this breakout. Again, did anything surprising happen? Anything you realized? Anything that you had in common? Anything that stood out to you? So we're gonna invite a couple of people to speak, and then because we're running a bit over time, we're gonna allow about 10 minutes or so for Q&A, any questions you may have. So anyone who would like to share from the breakout session, please raise your hand now. Again, if you're not comfortable sharing, if you're not comfortable speaking, you can share in the chat. Anything you found interesting in the breakout room, Michael?
Oh yeah. So how can we involve, for example, the local community? What we were saying, in our particular breakout room, going back also to the idea of citizens' assemblies and education and that aspect. I think it's also really important to recognise that actions and involving the local community has to be multi-layered. So, for example, we could post a leaflet through the door, we could speak to someone on the street, but we could also take part in other more radical actions with people. And I know that it's difficult for people to take that step into more radical actions, but that is something which we should also consider in the future going forward. So for me, what we talked about also in our group was what the Humanity Project is doing. And some people have expressed an interest in finding out more about the Humanity Project I've been talking to. So maybe it would be useful to put a link in about the Humanity Project and what they're doing. So what I'm basically saying and what we're basically saying, to engage people, it has to be multi-layered, engaging all stratas of our particular demographic area.
Yeah, that's spot on. So depending on who you want to reach, you want to use different communication strategies. So even within the same initiative, you may want to try different types of communication depending on who you want to recruit for any given activity. So that's a great insight. Thank you so much for sharing. Would anyone else like to share? I think someone else was going to speak earlier.
I've just put something in the chat, so I don't really need to say it. But basically, our group was talking about men sheds, so meetings just for men, doing something practical like gardening or allotments or something, or women just probably doing the same things. We've been showing Down the Drain and Hungry for Change at a local social club. So there's drink there, and we've had speakers afterwards so that people can actually sort of ask questions about that. I always think that cake and biscuits, a tea and coffee and alcohol are quite a good way of sort of loosening people up and drawing them in.
Thank you so much.
And collecting plastic on beaches, that quite often gets people coming together.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you also get people who are not necessarily engaged with climate issues, but they care about the local area, right? So that's a really good way of starting those conversations and thinking about how can we scale our impact.
And did I say repair shops? Because apparently that's really sort of draws people in anyway. Yeah,
also a really good way of, framing it around the cost of living crisis and engaging people, who are just trying to save money and making that connection with sustainability. Again, that's a really good example of the honeybee approach. So not necessarily framing it as a climate or sustainability issue, but focusing more on the money saving aspect of it.
Yeah, not having to throw things away just because they don't work.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Janet?
Oh yeah, I'm unmuted. Hi. So it's something that Mike was saying, Mike Basto, there's us two in that group, and we were talking about, and it's kind of what you were saying with the honeybee as well. I suppose I'm repeating it. But for example, if you're doing your litter pick in a community, like rather than just saying, "Oh, community litter pick, make the place look nice, better for nature and stuff," like come out and meet people, join the competition. I'm just thinking of all these like buzz things that you were saying. Oh God, what else? I don't know. If like you just said about your cups of tea, maybe have some flasks of tea as well. So kind of all these other nice things rather than, oh, we're just going to pick litter because it's better for the environment. Like, so it's something. It's kind of something now that I've got in my brain that I'm going to start doing with any of the adverts. Put all the other good things as well besides just nature, because that's what I'm personally driven by, the nature thing. So I've got to like switch off that bit of my brain and think of the other bits and get them onto adverts and posts and stuff. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And often it's also not necessarily about how can we communicate the specific activity in a way that will draw more people in. It's about offering more kinds of activities that will resonate with different people. So that's, I would almost say, although it takes more organizing power and organizing capacity, it's easier to reach more people by offering different kinds of activities rather than focusing on the communications aspect of one activity. And again, events and different kinds of activities and competition are all things you can experiment with and see how that goes, because obviously different things will work for different communities. Would anyone else like to share, or otherwise we will just open the space for Q&A, and if you would like to leave, please feel free, and if you have any questions, I can stick around and answer any questions that may arise. Karen?
I'd also say from experience that when you say competition, having a reward, which is money, is a big one. So it's just in our local village feast, we've been trying to engage people. We've got our tent, we've got various books, various things. But this year we did a competition, which was a quiz on emissions, and people had to guess how many balloons, blah, 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 was filled up from an idling car. And there was a £20 prize. They didn't have to pay to enter. And as a result, the engagement we had was absolutely superb. And we have a large traveller population in our village, and kids were dragging their dads who would never, ever come and talk to us. They were dragging their dads up to enter. It was also something where you didn't have to be able to read and write and all that sort of thing. So it was literally, there was a £20 prize. And it was a fair cop to everybody and no things. So I think that's what people want, because we were trying to think, what should we give as a prize? And actually it's money that they want. It's money that they want, not other things. Yeah.
I think that's a really brilliant example.
That's my partner who's a farmer. Yeah.
I think that's a really brilliant example of something that works really well, especially if you want to engage low-income communities and people who face barriers to engaging with these issues because they're under-resourced. So that's a really, really great way of bridging that gap. So yeah, great idea. Michelle.
Thanks. I just wanted to say, you don't have to organize a massively complex event. It is more important to have, as you were saying, Jessica, lots of different things on offer and regularly. So, things like knit and chat, where all you need is somebody to sit down with some wool and some knitting needles and just be there. And it's incredible how important that becomes for some people in terms of, feeling isolated, feeling a lack of confidence. We're seeing a lot of people who have regressed during COVID and are still not back where they used to be. So it doesn't have to be an all singing, all dancing event. Even a toy swap doesn't need to have a massive system. If somebody takes more than what they brought, well, then maybe they need it. So we are so stretched in terms of volunteers. The less systems in place, the more easily things can flow. We don't have to do everything according to the red tape and the health and safety. I mean, I'm not saying don't have health and safety. I'm just saying, we know it's over the top. You have your basic risk assessment and you just do loosely, what's important. And then just perhaps to mention about the young people. So at One Planet Abingdon, we have, we're trying to engage with the young people, and it's absolutely key to have them speaking for themselves. So we've created an Instagram account, and we've given at least 10 of them the keys to that Instagram account and encouraged them to do the posting. And I've been a bit surprised actually at how long it's taken for them to feel like they can just post. So that's a huge indicator for me about the confidence and how resilient these people are and how much work we have to do for them to feel like they can say how they feel about things. So yeah, and that's after 2.5 years of working with the community. So it is slowly, and it is basic, simple. Don't have to have all singing, all dancing. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing. And yeah, the social media thing is a really good example of, that sense of ownership and how that leads to agency. So if any of your initiatives have a social media account, recruit some social media volunteers who are between 16 and 25 to do this work, because they will do it well. Because as young people, we spend a lot of time on social media, and it's such a great way of feeling ownership of fostering that sense of ownership of in the initiative and empowering young people. And it's also a great thing for them to have on their CV, because pretty much every industry uses social media nowadays. So that's a really good example. But also the in chat that combines so many things that we covered today that are really effective. Social influence, you know, it's a safe space, it's a ritual, a social ritual. It's a bit of a honeybee approach, because people don't necessarily go there because of climate concern. They go there for the social interaction and to repair stuff to save money. So that's such a good example of an event that can be very, very successful and lead to greater engagement over time. Thank you. Would anyone else like to share or ask a question? Steve?
Just thinking about what you were saying, so with sort of growing more food, you know, locally, and just sort of saying to people, oh well, you know, all you need to do is eat more plant-based food or whatever, and that actually, if you can join up the food eating experience with the growing, then it's far more likely to be successful. I mean, in Nottingham, we've got EcoWorks, which is a community garden or community allotment, where they do a dig and dinner event every couple of times a week, where people just come along and they can help out doing growing, and meanwhile somebody's sort of cooking, so a bunch of people are cooking some food, which includes some of the food from the allotment, and you know, and then everybody sits down and has a nice meal at the end of it, and the food's always really, you know, superb. And I've been sort of wanting to do a sort of community supported agriculture sort of group in our area, which is sort of more accessible, by allowing people to sort of just grow a bit in their garden and be involved in part of it in a group, you know, that can sort of expand and change and incorporate everything from, you know, local fruit trees to you know, sort of community gardens and everything else, so that you sort of, you know, drawing people in, because I think maybe a lot of people's experience is that you actually do feel quite isolated, and it's quite hard to find people on the same wavelength as you know, perhaps with the same ideas. And I mean, there's a question, because I was sort of like, well, if there's people in my community that might be interested in doing the same sort of thing as me, it's like, well, how do you go about finding those people? Through social media or sort of advertising somehow out there to groups and so on, because you know, otherwise it's sort of, you know, within the small number of groups that you're actually involved with, it's quite difficult to, you know, to find those people. So yeah, if that's a good point to ask that question, maybe you've got some ideas about that.
Yeah, and I also just want to say that food growing is such a good example of the third golden rule of climate communication, which is substitution, not curtailment. So not telling people you have to eat less meat, you have to eat less processed food, all that kind of stuff. Just invite people to grow their own and then eat it, and develop that connection with a different way of eating. And showing how it can be done. I think that's such a good way. And also because you're doing it in a community context, again, you've got that social influence, you've got that ritual, you've got that success of having grown your own food, which is a reward, which helps develop a habit. And yeah, in terms of reaching more community members, I had a peer mentoring session a couple of weeks ago where we spoke about social media. And Facebook events are such a good way of reaching community members who have never heard of your initiative before. Because when you go on the events tab on Facebook, it will show you events in your local area. So even if people don't follow your Facebook page, they will still see the event and that it's happening in the local area. So I really encourage you to use that. Obviously, Instagram is great for reaching younger people. Some groups are starting to use TikTok as well if they want to reach teens and young adults. But yeah, for events, Facebook is really good.
Right.
I find myself, I don't use Facebook anymore, but I still use it for events sometimes. So that aspect of Facebook is still widely used.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Any questions? Any insights? Anything you'd like to share? No? All right. In that case, we will conclude the session. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming today, for being so engaged. You've been such a great group to work with. I hope you got a lot out of the information I shared and interacting with each other. I hope it gave you lots of ideas and inspiration, and I really hope that you'll be able to implement some of your learnings from today in your community, in your local communities. And we'll send around the slides and more resources as well, so you can look at them and use them in your own time.